All right, everybody, I think we'll begin. You are in the right class. It's just I'm not Alan or David today. So my name is Michael Miller Yoder. I'm a PhD student here in the Language Technologies Institute, and I'll be giving the guest lecture today on some of my work on social media analysis with NLP. All right, so a little bit of an overview of what we'll be doing today. So I'll give first kind of a lengthy motivation, an introduction on language and social context. And my goal there will be to get us in sort of the mindset of looking at language perhaps a little bit differently than you've been used to looking at language in this class before. And then I'll give a couple of examples of approaches when you have that mindset about looking at language and social context. Examples of using NLP to model specifically identity on social media and also an online narrative writing site. So we'll go through the details of these, but the first experiment is looking at self-presentation, and the second experiment I'll go over is looking at portrayal of characters and relationships. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to start off with a premise, an assumption here, really a thesis that I will argue for and try to demonstrate the utility of in this talk. So that thesis, if you remember one thing from today, this would be the thing, is a way of looking at language as embedded in social context. So I imagine you're talking about language in NLP class all the time, but this is perhaps a little bit differently than how you're used to talking about it. This is specifically in social context. So to start out, what types of social contexts do I mean, of course? What types of or domains of language are out there? So I don't mean like French versus English versus Chinese, but I mean what types of social situations is language used in? Do people use language in? So I actually want all of you to think about that and actually turn to a neighbor, and I realize people are pretty spaced out right now, so you might have to kind of move your chair around a little bit, but talk to somebody close to you. It could be groups of 2, groups of 3, and try to come up with a few different situations. These could be reading things or writing things, or when you hear language, when you see people use language, just different types of social situations in which people use language. And just jot them down on a laptop, on a piece of paper, whatever you want to do. So I'll give some time for people to do that, but talk to your neighbor about what, and give me a list of different types of social situations that you use language in. Does that make sense at all? Kind of? Okay. Another way of thinking about it is like picture a normal day and you're just going through your day. When does language actually pop up? When do you start saying things to people? When do you, maybe you're watching something, reading something, listening to something. List down some of those different social contexts. All right, go ahead. People do this.
You'll get some answers.
Okay, good. That's what I want. Some sort of engagement.
You'll get some sort
Any use of language. The broader, the better. Think of something interesting. Yeah. Or mundane. Mundane is interesting, I think, too. All right, I'm hearing some good discussion, but let's bring it back to the group if we could. So yeah, hold your thought in the back if you need to. But let's hear from a few of the groups. Just give me some social contexts that language is used in. Go ahead and raise your hand. Yeah.
Talking to strangers because a guy
Because a guy, yes, exactly. Right now, Thank you. It's the meta concept. Yes, I am using language right now to do something that you probably don't want to do, which is talk to a neighbor about some random thing. Thank you. So yes, talking to strangers. What else? Yes?
I stop at the stop sign, which says stop.
Signs. This is what I'm talking about. These weird things we just don't even think about, right? A sign actually says stop. We probably don't even read that sign every time we go to it. You know, there's multiple sorts of symbols going on. There's the red, there's the octagon, but it uses language to say stop. Yes?
When you use @mentions and hashtags to add new experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. So using something like an app mention, which not only is using language, but is actually calling out a certain symbol in a certain program or platform that you're using to actually include somebody in the conversation. That's excellent. I like that. Anybody else? Yes?
Taking notes on a lecture.
Taking notes on a lecture, which of course you all are actually. No, yes, that's an excellent point. I was going to bring up some student examples since everyone here is a student or has been a student. Anything else? Yes?
Yeah, so when you argue with someone on the internet about something, some issues,
Yeah.
any kind of debate.
There's all those political debates. I try to steer clear of them, but yes, lots of arguing going on online. What sorts of platforms are you thinking of?
So obviously that is one of them.
Yes, absolutely. Let's talk about Reddit. Yep. Yeah, Reddit's a great one. Any other uses that people are coming up with? In this section of the class. Yes.
Leaving a comment on YouTube videos.
Leaving a comment on YouTube videos. Yep. Yep. What about not online? Other contexts. Yes.
Which must be right, like seeing the numbers, CYG.
Yeah, absolutely. All those the numbers on the buses. How do they determine that? What sort of really old code are they using? I'm always wondering that. Somebody doesn't have one. Does see a hand all the way in the back there? Nope. Okay. You again.
Right. I mean, bees communicate by dancing to each other, right?
Yes, I am talking about human communication, but that is the coolest stuff ever, the bee communication, yes. Humans also dance, and that probably has different symbols of what kind of dancing you're doing. Yes.
Password exchanges like greetings and transactions at education.
Yeah, absolutely. The purchases we're doing every day, the buying, the selling, those sorts of economic interactions. Okay, this is awesome. Folks are really getting the hang of this now. So these are the sort of everyday situations. So a few that I came up with, chatting, we're doing this all the time, whether it's on Messenger, actually sending texts, all sorts of things. This whole chat interface, it actually took a while to develop through the 90s. There's a very interesting history of that. First, you could see everything the person was writing on different platforms. Then people said, no, you can't do that, because then you can see when people make mistakes, and I have to push the enter button. Anyway, there's fascinating things about that. Of course, face-to-face interactions with people, whether that's friends and who you're living with, whether that's family, it can be on the phone or in person here. Language is often grounded in, like right here, it looks like the person is talking about an image, this sort of thing. This is one thing that comes up when you Google for Alan Black. There are many wonderful things that come up when you Google for Alan Black. But this would be an example of an advertisement, which we see all the time. We're just surrounded by ads. It could be on a billboard. It could be on a YouTube video. All this sort of stuff is using language in particular ways. What about something like this, like a sports report? This is kind of weird. This is sort of like the bus ticker that someone was mentioning. Sometimes language is very symbolic, it's very structured. As computer scientists, we kind of like it when it is. So this would be an example of some Euroquals. And then somebody brought up the example of taking notes. What about these sort of online or homework instructions, which as students we all are very familiar with. And that's a particular kind of writing, isn't it? It's do this, and then do this, and then do this, and we all know I'm going to try to do all these things and then get an A in that course. I don't think anyone mentioned like TV shows. This one's animated Steven Universe, but all other stuff like TV shows and movies that we're watching all the time. All of these are using language in particular contexts. They're actually voicing particular characters, which I think is very interesting. Of course, lots of people mentioned online things, so Twitter as an example, and also traditional news, which we're often consuming on our phones nowadays or online, so different types of media here. All right, so my point here is if we actually think about where we use language, we come up with a huge variety of different social situations. Now, my next question is for NLP, what is language? And this is a very funny question, what is language? So what do I mean by that? I mean, what is prototypical language? When NLP systems are building models of language, what are they really thinking about? What are they prototypically assuming is actually language? Which of these social contexts? So does anybody have a guess on that, or a response to that? What are the, when you think about an NLP model you might be training, what is the data usually? What is prototypical data? Yes? A string of UTF-8 encodings, that is correct. Yes. Now, what about the social context of where those UTF-8 encodings came from? In the back.
Formal written context.
Yeah, formal written context. Absolutely. That's usually what I'm going with for here. So if we're thinking about NLP, I'll give a little brief timeline here. You'll have to forgive me. Let's see. On your left is going to be 1990. Before that, the Dark Ages, expert systems, who knows what. They actually invented neural networks back then, so don't give them crap. All right, so then we have the statistical machine learning NLP kind of days in the 90s and 2000s. So if you think about what is prototypical language in that era, we're going to have something like the Penn tree bank, which maybe you're familiar with in this class. Maybe not anymore. But pretty fundamental. It has everything with part of speech tags. It has these nice constituency parses for you. And what is that based on? It's based on the Wall Street Journal for the most part. They actually did pull from a variety of different sources, but mostly from the Wall Street Journal. And not only that, but it's Wall Street Journal from 1987 to 1989. So if you think about this a little bit, how crazy this is. So if we think about all the language that we use on a daily basis, and what NLP considers to be prototypical English in this case, news might be tip of the iceberg, and the Wall Street Journal from 1987 to 1989, before most of you all were born, would be very, very tip of the iceberg here. So okay, have we done better since then? Around 2010, 2011, people might say we've been doing more complex neural models of language have come into fashion in NLP. And so let's see, the most recent fashion is this model called BERT. It performs very well on a number of tasks. Let's see what that's trained on. It is trained on mostly the English Wikipedia, and also for English that is, and also this books corpus, which is kind of an interesting addition, I think. But if we look at mostly Wikipedia, all right, that's more text than the Wall Street Journal from 87, 89. But there are definitely issues with Wikipedia itself, of course. If we think about representation, about who's writing, who's contributing to Wikipedia, this sort of thing, we get quickly into some social issues going on. And it actually might be less representative of spoken language than some of the things they added to the Penn tree bank. All right, so my point is that what we often miss in NLP is that language occurs in all these different social situations. And we tend to abstract language from things like who's actually producing the language, who are the speakers, who's the audience, what's the situation, what's the purpose of the language. And you might be thinking, okay, we have good reason for looking at something like news and something written and formal, as people have noted, right? If we're thinking about like what is most quintessential, representative, abstracted from all those messy social contexts, news might be the thing, right? And I would argue that actually there's some issues here too. If we look at something like the Penn tree bank, which is supposed to be this sort of abstracted language thing, there's some funny things going on. So it's also has social context baked in. So actually on the training set, there's something called section 23 of the test set for constituency parsing in the Penn tree bank. And this, people have noticed, is this kind of funny like stock ticker sort of stuff here where we have rates in the financial markets. And so some systems, when we're doing this sort of hill climbing thing in NLP and we're trying to get 98.5% accuracy over someone else's 98.2% accuracy, sometimes systems are just relying on parsing this sort of thing, which I think people would argue is hardly representative of normal language, whatever that is. So, so my point is, the point that I would make is that language is always embedded in social contexts. And what we need to do is not control for these necessarily, but actually accept the influence of these things on our data, and also accept them and recognize them as being there, and actually maybe even use NLP to model them, which is what my work does. So this is actually, it's actually a little bit more controversial than you think. This might seem so obvious, right, in all these contexts that we came up with, but this is quite a different way of thinking about language than is normally done in NLP, and also a lot of linguistics, actually. Because we're always trying to get at that abstract sense of language. And I've seen a lot of grad students often, including myself sometime, we just get some data and we don't really care where that data came from. So my lesson would be, think about where that data came from. Think about who labeled that data. Who gave the annotations? What social things like those stock tickers might be going on in the purposes of that data that you might not be thinking of when you're building a system? So NLP seems to be coming around in some form. This is a pretty big name in NLP right now, Noah Smith, and at a conference, ACL, I still remember a quote, a keynote by him, that language is by and about people, and we have to remember that. So that's a good thing. Okay, so we have this sort of mindset down now, and what are the things we can do with that? That's my next question. But before I go on, do we have any questions about that sort of language in social context and what I mean by that? Anybody questions? Good, okay. All right, so what can we do with this? What are some applications if we take on that mindset? Anybody have any ideas on some applications of NLP on something like social media when we have that mindset? And we're looking at language actually in the real world, the real social world. Yeah.
Your boss can be more natural.
Yeah, your boss can be more natural. Yeah, if people are trying to change how they sound, like trying to be sounding more natural, for example. Absolutely. We can maybe study what language do people consider more natural in some situations, what language do people not consider natural, and do some NLP and figure out what's going on there. That's really an interesting point. There have been some different little apps I've seen on trying to make people more polite or less polite or this sort of thing. Absolutely. Anything else? Yeah.
You can see if it's actually possible to profile people by the language they use.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a huge topic. Is it the case that when you think about somebody's ethnicity, race, gender, what have you, can we actually figure something like that out from the language that they use? And I'll talk more about that actually in the second part. Absolutely. What are some other applications? What if we think about recent current events, maybe even with white supremacy, white nationalism online, what tech companies might be wanting to do? Anybody have an idea about how we can use NLP on social media? Yeah?
Hate speech.
Right, exactly, yeah. So detecting things like hate speech. So, So that's the first thing, one of the things we can do with this. Also, community norms, I think this is very interesting. Somebody brought up Reddit. And yeah, how do you know when you start reading posts on Reddit what the flavor of a community is and what sort of ideologies they might have underneath the surface, and maybe what would make you want to contribute to that or change the community norm even. Fairness and bias. This is a really cool paper where NLP practitioners were looking at selected corpora across different decades and looked at stereotypes and bias against women, against different ethnic groups in the United States. So you track that with NLP. Media framing. There's some really interesting work from people here at CMU who are doing some analysis about what topics journalists in different countries are choosing to talk about, and then the words that they're choosing to describe different people in those articles. This is really interesting work. How about right now, NLP tools are mostly geared toward English speakers or speakers of one of a handful of really, really popular languages. And they also ignore things like world Englishes, that is English spoken outside of of North America and Europe, and different types of English. We could build tools that are more sensitive to these sorts of things and actually work for them, acknowledge them, this sort of thing, because most of the English is spoken outside of the U.S., for example. All right, so that was questions on applications. Anybody? All right, so now I'll move into a little bit of my own work on giving you some examples of NLP approaches to specifically to modeling identity. All right, so a little bit of background. Identity obviously has an enormous bearing on people's lives, enormous impact. Just about a month ago, the U.S. Supreme Court was hearing a case on whether or not in this country you can be fired based on gender identity and sexual orientation. And in that case, and I would argue most cases, identity is inextricable from language. In particular, in this legal case, for example, we have the meaning of the word sex in a bill from the 1960s. How does that apply today to gender identity, this sort of thing? This is what people are trying to figure out. Every year, identity brings people to the streets. This is a picture right here in Pittsburgh, and then also in New York City, a Pride March. So these are issues that really affect people's lives. Okay, so what academic frameworks do we have for looking at identity and identity in language? So I'd like to set up a contrast between identity approaches, what I'm calling more critical approaches that often are coming from more qualitative fields that I'll give some examples of, and then there's also computational approaches. And then my work, where my work is kind of in the middle of that. All right, so on those more critical identity approaches, there's a field within linguistics, which I'm very interested in, sociolinguistics. So this is looking at how different people speak differently, how people can use language to do things socially. And people there would say that identity is actually the product rather than the source of linguistic variation. And this is sort of a different way of thinking about identity than we're used to. So we're used to thinking about identity as something very internal, maybe like a set of categories or fill out a census. But this is actually saying identity comes out of your sense of who you are and who others are, comes out of social and linguistic interaction. This is very interesting, I think. So it positions identity kind of outside the person and really influenced more by society and culture. So another of these critical identity approaches, gender studies, is looking at identity and considering identity to be shifting and contextual. So then something like gender not denoting a substantive being, but actually being constructed socially, which is a little bit different from how we're normally thinking about things. So here we have the idea that identity can be changing and be influenced by society and culture. From critical race theory, we have the idea that we're not just a set of categories, but we actually live at the intersections of those categories, something called intersectionality, where something like race and sex can be specific to someone's lived experience, the classic case in the United States being that of black women. And then from discourse analysis, which is another subfield of linguistics, we have the idea that identity might not relate to an internal state as much, but actually relate to performances in society. So right now, you're all performing as students, and I use the word performing not to mean like a fake sort of thing, but just actually acting out a role, basically, which we do all the time. So you're all our students right now. I am being a presenter right now. And if you're a student and if you continually go to classes and that sort of thing, it'll build up a sense of being a student, whatever that means for yourself. So this is sort of the way of thinking about identity. It's a little bit different than how we're probably used to. So identities now, it can vary depending on the situation. All right, so I'll contrast that with computer science approaches at this point. Many approaches. So a classic task in computer science and computational linguistics would be user attribute inference. So kind of like what you were talking about a little bit, where we have some sort of behavioral data, let's say language, from people, and we try to build this machine learning classifier or some sort of statistical model that predicts what sort of a person produced that behavioral data. So in this case, we're trying to figure out, just from Twitter user language, gender, age, regional origin, and even political orientation. So this is kind of right back where we started, where we're just thinking about identity as a latent, stable, psychological maybe, construct that's just internal. And again, in computational linguistics, with user attribute inference, the goal here would be to do something like public health or marketing or politics. And these, of course, these fields have different goals that I'm describing. So this would be more the computer science goal. But I would argue that this sort of mindset about identity can lead to some sort of problematic things. So this is a controversial paper from 2018 from the Stanford group. That they built a deep neural network that can identify from a bunch of dating site profile images the sexual orientation just from the face, and better than human accuracy, they claimed. So what are my issues here? I would say that this is just reinforcing the idea that something like sexual orientation, which we just saw from humanities scholars, can be changing, can be contextual, can be depend on culture and society. Now we're just reducing it down to be read off of somebody's face, which is also pretty problematic if you think of surveillance and this sort of thing from different governments and that. All right, so identity is now just in the face here. So my question with my work right now is, can we investigate the production of identity language with computational models? Can we take some of the insights from that qualitative work and use that to enrich our own computational models of language and identity? So if we do that, I would claim that the negative thing that we're trying to avoid here is we're avoiding naturalizing these structures of identity, that is, these big structures that actually marginalize those who don't fit them. If we think of gender as a binary thing, for example. And on the positive side, I think if we have this mindset, we can discover how notions of identity are being reinforced or challenged or reinvented in discourse. For example, maybe you're a woman and my advisor, for example, is a woman and tells me about these instances where she's online and she's like writing in a forum and that sort of thing. But she can actually play up like, oh, I'm going to use features that indicate that I'm a woman, or I'm going to use features that indicate that I'm not a woman. So people are doing this. There's an agent behind this. You can play with these sorts of things. Whereas if we just build machine learning classifiers to figure out people's gender online, you're forgetting about all that. So I think it's really interesting to use these notions to discover how people are positioning themselves online. All right, that was a lot of like background theory that might not be applicable to anyone's actual studies right now. But any questions so far? Okay. All right, so I'll give a couple of examples of projects. And in each of these projects, what we're doing, broad framework, is we have some sort of a language and social questions, some research questions going in. We have to build our own data sets because in NLP, they often have like a standard data set, but with the social stuff, there's often not. So we're building our own data set. And then we're going to do some machine learning and usually set up a prediction task. And our goal here is a little bit different. It's not just to get the best predictions necessarily, but usually we're trying to do some sort of interpretation of these and figure out relationships between variables, the y and the x there, like language and social variables, and figure out what's going on in these corpora. So, all right, let's start out here. The first project is self-presentation effects on social media. And it's not just me doing this work, it's a whole host of people, excellent people. All right, so in this project, we're looking at explicit identity positioning. By explicit, I mean people are actually giving a label to themselves. So our working definition of identity is the social positioning of self and other. So I'm going to claim this label over here. I'm going to say I'm a big fan of the Supernatural TV show, and that's going to position me over here, and I'm positioning others, maybe people who hate that show, as over there. That's what's going on here with identity. So our question is, how does the social positioning of self affect interaction on social media? We're not so interested if someone says, I'm male, I'm 24 years old, and that has no effect on any interaction that person has. And for the data for this site, we're looking at a social media site called Tumblr. It's a little bit old nowadays, but it has lots of young people. It's a site with particular identity implications. People are talking about identity issues a lot on Tumblr, and there's a lot of social interaction on Tumblr as well. All right, so if you're not familiar, are people familiar with Tumblr? Okay, a few out there, cool. So this is what you might see if you're logged into Tumblr. So it's a dashboard of people you follow, they're making posts. It's sort of a microblogging, like Twitter, but also kind of a hybrid with regular blogging. You can make, it's very multimedia, you can make a variety of different types of posts. You can see some artwork there. This is an example of a Tumblr blog. So you can see that there's lots of aesthetic things going on. Every user has their own blog, and I would argue that this blog represents their identity in some sense on the site that they build. A lot of young people, a lot of aesthetics going on, and I'd like to draw your attention to, in this project, we're going to be using on the bottom left there, this blog description. So this is just an empty box that people fill out about themselves and about their blog, which I think is fascinating in its own right to see what people say in these little bio boxes. We're going to use those. So great, we have these explicit social positioning. We're going to use these blog descriptions. These are really messy. So people do put whatever they want in there, long quotes, copy-paste stuff. There are links to their Instagrams, all sorts of stuff. But we noticed as we were looking through that there was a convention that we were calling list descriptions, where people were actually giving short bursts of information about themselves. So these are two fabricated examples here. You can see things like age, things like who I'm against, maybe who should not follow me, things that reference gender, ethnicity or nationality things, all sorts. So our specific research question in this project is what effects of similarities and differences in self-positioning do we see on content propagation on Tumblr? And by content propagation, I mean who shares what, whose posts. So on Tumblr, it's something called reblogging, but you can think of it like retweeting on Twitter, or anywhere where we're sharing another person's post. That's our outcome variable. And then we're going to use these blog descriptions to represent the people here. All right, questions at this point about Tumblr and things? I'm going to keep asking for questions, and so it's better if someone goes for it. Okay. All right, so what we do here is we set up a machine learning prediction task, and we define this opportunity, we call it, where basically if I'm a follower here and I have multiple followees, of course, followees being people who I follow, but we can actually choose two of those followees. They both post posts around the same time, and I choose to reblog one of those posts, and I choose to not reblog the other post, even though it's likely that I've seen that post. So this is the structure that helps us get at this question about what effect the actual identity positioning has. If you want to get technical, we're doing a learning to rank pairwise formulation here. And that gives us a nice balance between our positive and negative class too with machine learning. So we're going to represent our users with extracted features from the blog descriptions. That's what's going on here. Yes?
Do you not care at all about the actual content of the post?
We do, yes. That's a very important point. So if you want to do a prediction of like what gets reblogged or retweeted or whatever, that would be the most obvious thing to do, right? And that's extremely important, is what the actual post contains. So yes, we have some features related to that. What we're trying to do is, on top of that signal, which we already kind of know, and it's established from previous work, is there any signal from actually the interaction between people's identity positioning? That's what we're going after. Yeah, excellent question. Anyone else wondering something? Okay. All right, so we extract two levels of identity. So we have categories and labels. Categories being groups of labels that sort of correspond to a dimension of identity. So we have things like age, gender, personality type, and then the specific labels themselves. Now we don't want to, I said the whole point of this is not to come in with our own categories and pretend that those are the only ones that matter, and thus naturalize, reify these categories. So what we're going to do is we're going to bootstrap to figure out which categories are relevant in this context of Tumblr. So to do that, we manually group the most popular words that we're seeing into 11 categories, do some manual annotation, come up with some regular expressions to extract these features, and here are the 11 categories that we're finding. So you can see here that it's a mix of these big demographic categories like age, something like that, but also things that are specific to Tumblr. Fandoms. So fandom is a big deal on Tumblr. It's TV shows, movies, books, comics, all that stuff. So people were often orienting themselves, which fandom are you a part of? What are you a fan of? Also music is a big deal. K-pop, that sort of thing. Also things like zodiac sign. Very popular to put in your blog description. So we included that as well as a category. Yes?
English or Chinese?
So we are only looking at English right now.
No, I mean English or Chinese zodiac.
Boy, I do not know much about the zodiac. So our feature extractors were mostly English, but then there's these like amazing emojis that I included as well. Anyway, that probably doesn't answer your question. It's probably English, whatever like an American like me would be familiar with. Yeah.
I'm just working on you.
Okay. Anyone else? Questions? Okay. All right, so for data we sampled 1,000 users who have blog descriptions and a minimum level of activity. We paired each reblog up to 5 posts that were not reblogged. These are our pairs. So now we have around 700,000 pairs to do our machine learning on. This all takes place in 2018, the data from this. All right, so features in the back there, mentioning about the actual post. Yes, so these are our baseline features where we have the hashtags. We also, as a kind of a representative of the content, we also have the number of likes, reblogs, and comments. We know that if something is just like a funny meme going around, we want to get a handle on control for that, basically. So that's our measure of controlling for that. We also know that things like GIFs will be more popular than somebody's long rant and text. So we include the post type as a feature. And then on top of that, we're including different identity features. So this would be a relational identity between the person who's posting and the person who's following. So things like, do they give the same categories? This is kind of a curious one because you can give age, you can give your name, you can give your gender, or you can not. And so by giving these things alone, if we both give, let's say, fandoms, regardless of what fandom they are, we're probably orienting ourselves toward the platform in a certain way. So maybe that matters. We'll see. And then label alignment. This, of course, would be like if we give the exact same label, or if we don't. If we don't give the exact same label, or if we give specific combinations of labels. Maybe all the Star Wars people love the Harry Potter people, or vice versa. Who knows? So we include these things as features. Questions on the features at this point? Okay. All right. So our question is there an effect? And we actually do see quite a bit of an effect from the identity features included in this task, more than I actually expected. So right on the left there, you'll see 50-50 is random, and for that post baseline feature, so this is what is in the post, you can get about 63% accuracy on this task, regardless of, we tried a few different models, linear and nonlinear. And then if we add in the category features, you can see that we do get actually a significant increase in performance. Just for some categories, we get a significant increase in performance, some we don't. And then we get quite a bit of a jump if we add in those label alignment features, which I think is pretty interesting. And then if you add in everything, you do get a very significant increase, especially for our feed-forward neural net model. So if you remember, though, I'm interested in the prediction task, but that's not the whole point of this work. The point is to figure out what types of identity positioning matter for this sort of content propagation on Tumblr. So we want to do some interpretation, right? And so to do that, we look at the learned feature weights in our logistic regression models. And these were generally learning positive coefficients for category label match features and negative for mismatches. So this is what you might expect, right? If people put similar labels, we find that they're more likely among their followers to reblog that content. But this is a little more interesting. Specific interaction features between labels were sometimes most informative. So let's look at these a few examples of these. So at the category level, pronouns is one of our categories. So whether or not you give your pronouns, regardless of what pronouns you give, and we found that actually people who the follower is the person who is making the decision about whether to reblog something. If they present pronouns and the person they're looking at their post and that person does not present pronouns, they're actually less likely to reblog. Now, none of this is causal, of course. This is all very correlational, so take everything with a big grain of salt. But this is the sort of just statistical patterns that we were seeing here. So what do we make of that? Maybe it's a conception of gender kind of thing. Yes.
For the last one,
Yes.
is this people who explicitly identify as such?
Yes.
Or people, oh yes.
Yes, yes. So this is a very, very important point. Thank you, Alan. So last one is people who explicitly give a label cis or cisgender, that is not transgender. So we would assume that most people in the data set are cisgender, they're just not telling us that. So again, this is kind of back to what I'm interested in, which is how we don't really care about what the person is behind the scenes, we care about how they're positioning themselves. So if I give that label cisgender, we found that it means you're more likely to reblog other people who give that label. Now this one was interesting because we found a slightly negative weight on people who are saying they're cis on reblogging people who are trans or positioning themselves as trans, which is kind of interesting because giving a cisgender label usually kind of indicates that you're aware of conversations about trans issues. So maybe it's a limitation of what's going on there, I'm not sure. The middle ones, so we found that we kind of divide it's hard to figure out whether someone's talking about ethnicity or nationality, but if we draw a line there, we saw that race and ethnicity seemed to matter more for reblogging than something like nationality we weren't seeing an effect. Any other questions on these? Okay, a few others that are kind of interesting. So in general, we were finding that people who had shared values or shared experiences were more likely to share each other's content. People who were listing their shared experiences. So similar ages, things like anime and design. Okay, maybe you're both interested in interesting visual content, related to something like anime. Gaming and manga, maybe it's sort of a similar type of person. But it's hard to say exactly. But these sorts of things were giving us some feature weight. You can contrast that with maybe not shared values or experiences going into the platform, or someone's really interested in like lighthearted memes. They're a little bit less likely to reblog someone who is more into history, though. I've seen some good history memes out there, though. So not to diss history. All right. So just wrapping up this project. So we're finding an evidence for an association between explicit self-presented identity information and content propagation. This is actually a little bit new. Most studies who are looking at something like content propagation, for example, thinking, all right, how do we predict what's going to go viral? How do we predict what's going to be fake news, for example? They usually only look at what's in the post. What's the content of the post. And they might also look at network features, that is, how fast is something spreading, because we know that certain things spread more quickly than others. And this is so what I want to be doing here is an example of actually something like content propagation is a decision by a person to actually share someone else's content. So I want to bring those people back in here, and it seems to give us a little bit of traction on this task. All right, and users who presented, we found that users who presented labels that indicated shared interests or shared values at some level were more likely to share each other's content. This was varied. We saw some variation on this, but this is what, in general, we were finding. All right, questions on that? Yes?
So is this kind of basically resolving that, like, echo chambers exist? Like, or can you touch on, like, how that sort of is?
Yeah, absolutely. So just caveat, I mean, this is like 1,000 Tumblr users we're looking at, so I would not make any broad claims about how the internet works from this. But it does sort of point to, in general, that people are relating to each other on that level of identity positioning, and there you can see an effect. So yeah, it would be on the side, if you're thinking of the internet as sort of this 2000s era, like, oh, it's this great debate era, like, platform where everyone has an equal voice, and we're just doing things out of democracy, then that's a vote against that, and more on the echo chambers side. Now, I would argue that the echo chambers idea is a little bit different with Tumblr, because people are going onto Tumblr to find their own people, usually. To find their own communities, whatever they're into, a specific type of artwork. There's a huge LGBTQ community on Tumblr, this sort of thing. So I think when we say echo chambers, it's usually a negative type of connotation. But sometimes, I mean, there also is kind of a positive side of finding one's community, especially for people who are marginalized in larger society. It might have difficulty doing that. Yes?
I don't use Tumblr, so forgive me.
That's fine.
But how is using these labels different from using, say, tags?
Yeah, so
Which would be a pretty common feature that most recommendation engines use.
right. So yeah, it's a really good question. So tags are great on Tumblr. So they allow spaces, and there's kind of a culture of like writing an entire sentence of commentary in the tags. They're really hilarious and interesting. So tags are doing a lot of the same thing. Yeah, it's like you're showing your personality through kind of everything you do on a site like Tumblr. So right now we're just kind of looking at the very explicit level identity features, which would be these blog descriptions where people are actually saying who they are. And that seems to have a little bit of an impact on a machine learning task like this. Now, we actually do include the tags as a baseline feature. We have those in there as representation of the post. But it gets kind of muddy because, yeah, people are kind of positioning themselves through the tags. They have images, usually not of themselves, because Tumblr is not like a Facebook thing where you're trying to interact with real people. People in the real world, excuse me, offline. But there's all sorts of ways that we're not really capturing this task. We're just scratching the surface on these explicit identity positions. Yeah. Other questions? These are good. All right. Okay, so kind of changing gears here, I'll give an example of another project. We're looking at the changes in portrayal of characters and narrative with this one. All right, so the other one was very explicit positioning, right? I am a girl, what have you. This is more implicit in narrative. So again, not just me, I had the pleasure of working with some great master's students and PhD students and my advisor. All right, so motivation for this project, we're examining how others' identity is being positioned in narrative. Specifically in different narrative characters. So can computational models capture basic changes in the narrative portrayal of characters' identity? That's what we're after here. And we're using something called fan fiction for this. And this is fiction created by fans of TV shows, movies, books, comics, etc. Anybody has heard of fan fiction out there? Yeah, all right, cool. Yeah, there's a lot, fan fiction. And there is a ton of fan fiction out there. If you're a machine learning person, get excited about fan fiction just because of the sheer number of stories. People write books that are longer than like 6 times War and Peace. It's just fascinating. There's tons of material out there. All right. So the site that we use for data for this project is Archive of Our Own. Archive of Our Own is fantastic in that it's actually run by fans themselves. And this is like a quintessential how, I just love the title of this one, How Love Hurts. So a lot of these are about relationships, are about love, and are known for getting erotic as well. So anyway, but as a machine learning person, we love, the great thing about Archive of Our Own is that fan fiction authors provide all of their, these great metadata about the stories themselves. So we have what are the characters in this story? We have what fandom does it belong to? We have something interesting called the category. These are the gender of the two or more characters involved in the romantic relationships in this story. So here we have male, male, which is actually the most common pairing, is gay male pairings in fan fiction. So that's really interesting, contrasted with mainstream media. People are losing it in the back there.
Just, you know, when I opened on my phone right now, the first Chrome tab that's opened is like this website.
So there's Tom.
Yes, that's amazing. Somebody's into fan fiction.
Well, it's something I wrote for sure, yeah.
Cool. Okay. Awesome. All right. Yes. AO3. All right. So our question is, can we capture changes in character and relationship framing in fan fiction with word embedding based methods? All right. So, oh, sorry. That was a lot of text there. So this is more of a methods piece. I've heard you've gone through some distributional semantics, things like word to vec, word embeddings. Can we capture changes in these framing with word embedding based methods? All right. So the reason we're using word embeddings is that people have started, there's a growing body of work on using things like distributional semantic representations for social questions in language. So things like stereotype and bias in corpora. I actually gave an example of this paper a while ago. But that was using word embeddings. Things like framing by different social groups. We had a mention of Reddit. So this paper was looking at Reddit, how people talk about things like gun control on different subreddits. So our question is, can word embeddings capture social framing of relationships in fan fiction? We have a couple of hypotheses. These are more methods focused, so it might not be as interesting, but we're looking at whether or not, so normally with word embeddings, people just throw all the text in. We're looking at whether text that is relevant to characterization provides a stronger signal for learning shifts in relationship portrayal. And then we also want to know whether we can actually do this. We can actually capture differences in relationship portrayal using vector representations in embedding space. Okay, so for this one, we're going to use Harry Potter stories as just a starting point. So we have around 180,000 stories. It's a lot as of 2018, just on this one website. And what we're going to do is we're going to narrow down to a set of characters that are often paired together in romantic relationships in different ways, both in the original series with J.K. Rowling and also in fan fiction. So this is popularity based on fan fiction. You can see that Draco Harry is by far and away the most popular pairing. Fan fiction authors love Draco. It's sort of like, I guess it's like kind of the bad boy aesthetic going on. Which is very different from Draco in the original series. If people are, sorry, if you're not familiar with Harry Potter, none of this will make sense at this point, but other slides will. So what we do is we narrow it down to 6 popular pairings, and we set up another machine learning prediction task. And our question here is a little bit tricky, is does the relationship match canon being the original stories, in being romantic or not romantic? So we have 2 characters, and if they're romantic in canon, so this is true if they're romantic in canon and romantic in fan fiction, or if they're not romantic in canon and they're also just friends in fan fiction. This will be true, and it's false if there's a difference here. So we're asking, does the fan fiction author change this relationship in this particular story? All right, so for this first research question, it's more of a methods thing. We want to focus on portions of stories that are relevant to relationship characterization. So to do that, we have a bit of an NLP pipeline that we borrowed for some previous work and extended with some help from the great master students. So what this gives you is, for every single fic is a story on fan fiction, there's all this lingo. But this will give you quotes and assertions from characters, nicely co-referenced, pronoun resolutions, all that. So now we have some features we can go with for these characters. And then for the relationship representations, we want a particular representation in embedding space for different characters and relationships. So the way we do that is we take a weighted average of word embeddings around character name mentions. And we actually don't use the character name here because we don't want the machine to learn specific things about specific characters, but rather about the contexts in which fan fiction authors are changing the relationship. So this little toy example here, we want a representation for Harry and Hermione. We're going to use the word embeddings in this case a 2-word window, which would be a terrible idea, around character name mentions and take a weighted average there. And then concatenate those together to come up with a relationship embedding, you might say, or vector for this relationship in the particular story. So that's kind of a mouthful in the methods here, but any questions? All right. So this is just logistic regression because we just wanted to test the utility of these representations that we're building. So we can see that a couple of things from this graph. If we just throw in all the text like people usually do with word embeddings, then we come up with around 55% accuracy. Narrowing things down to the actual text that describes the particular characters is a great idea. We get much better representations using that. And then also you can see the difference between the blue bars and the green bars. We're getting a significant improvement if we use this vector difference that we've constructed. So that is the representation for the relationship in canon over here, and the representation for the specific story, and then doing the vector difference there, including that as a feature for our machine learning model. All right, so that's the first part of this this project. But any questions for this? Yes.
In the first part,
Yeah.
in all text, what are you actually taking as the feature?
So the features are it's the entire text actually that mentions these two stories, or these two characters rather.
So you're taking the characters in the text and you're just comparing whether these characters are coming together or that's it.
Well, yeah, we're comparing whether or not the relationship changed in this particular story. So this would be like, so when you throw in all the text and just like take this weighted average on all the words, it's really asking like, all right, if I just look at the word embeddings for this entire story, can I tell if this story has a relationship that's different from the original story? That's what that's doing. And then if I narrow in my focus on the feature extraction on just where the characters that I care about are mentioned, we're seeing an improvement. So it might be kind of obvious that's the case, but normally people do just throw it all in. And this also kind of points to that these social signals, if we're getting something a little bit tricky, like has a person change the relationship, they're kind of buried. So it's good to focus in. Question or in the back, yeah.
Were your your relationship, like they're just romantic around it, right?
Yeah, it's confusing. So
Like were your relationships considered like a relationship is either romantic or it's not romantic, right?
yes,
Okay.
yes.
Did your predictions ever do better than like romantic to not romantic, or anywhere? Or just generally the same possible?
You mean accuracy on these different sort of?
Yeah, so like say the canon story was a romantic story and the fan fiction story was a non-romantic story.
Right.
Do that do better in prediction than say a non-romantic canon story going to a romantic fan fiction story?
Yeah, so answer that's a little tricky. So our actual prediction task is, it's a particular story and then a particular set of two characters, and the question is whether or not their relationship is the same romantically in canon as that particular story. So it's slightly different from actually predicting whether or not these two characters are romantic in the story. It's whether or not they're romantic and either they're romantic in canon or not. So it's like how the author has changed them. Now we actually did do the prediction task of whether the characters are romantic, which I think is like not as interesting, but it's still interesting to run. And I think for that one, let me try to remember. I think the quotes were not as helpful. It was more about like the assertions, being narration and evaluation of the characters, what they were doing. But yeah, so slightly different results for that task than the one that we were doing. Yeah. Does that make sense? Did I really answer?
I think I was asking the psychopath thing.
Okay. Yeah. Another question I saw here.
Is it dumb to ask like what the point of this was? Are you getting that? Like, it would be nice for a machine to be able to be like, that's not canon. Like,
Right,
if you had a bot
right.
that could like go around software being like, that's not canon. That'd be fun.
Right,
But, like,
right.
is there like a
Yeah.
real world application?
Yeah, excellent point. So this project is really, so my main goal is actually to look at representations of gender and sexuality in fan fiction because they're so different from mainstream media. I want to draw attention to that in different ways to see what's going on at a higher level. So this project is really, there isn't like a real world application just from this. It's whether or not a set of methods can be even useful to get at some of that. So it's sort of like a stepping stone. So the first step is, can we use some of these techniques in NLP to actually look at, can it capture something basic about relationships, representations in fan fiction? That is, how we change the relationship. So yeah, it's more of a stepping stone. Other questions? Cool. All right, so we did some visualization for this too. How am I doing on time, Alan?
You have 15 minutes.
Cool. All right. So we also did some visualization. For this little mini experiment, we wanted to actually include the names in this point, and we wanted to track changes in this time contextualize embeddings for character names across different stories. So the goal, this one is a little bit more real world, I guess. It's like the goal would be to build representations for how specific stories are changing characters. Some details there on the methods. It's based on a technique called Elmo, which gives you, Word2Vec, if you remember, gives you an embedding or a vector for every single word type that is like a word in the corpus, or excuse me, in your training data. But then these sort of approach, contextualized word embeddings, give you a different vector for every single instance of the word in the documents that you're using. So we're actually doing that with fan fiction because we want to see how, for example, Harry Potter, how Harry has shifted from the original story in particular particular fics or stories. If that makes sense. Yeah, so to do that, we use that sort of a technique. What this gives us is for every single story, this is kind of what I just mentioned. So for the word Hermione here, we're coming up with vectors that are different depending on which story Hermione is in. And then what we did here, it's a little bit hard to see, but I apologize for that. But we learned these representations, these vector representations for different characters, and we also learned these in the original canon stories. And we then did some dimensionality reduction because these are like 300 dimensions down to 2 for graphing with an approach called TSNE. And here we have different clusters you can see. Each cluster corresponds to a character, and the stars that you can see here, sort of hard to see, black stars, are where that character representation is for the original series. So what we found here that might be more interesting is that the canon vector sometimes is more on the edge of all the different fan fiction vectors, and sometimes it's more in the middle. So in the top there you can see for character Draco, it's on the edge, which really confirms what we knew qualitatively, that, like I mentioned, fan fiction authors love Draco and do things with Draco Draco is characterized very differently in fan fiction in general. Contrast that with Harry in the bottom here, where fan fiction authors are often doing things with Harry, like Harry is characterized very similarly. You can also see a couple of characters, Remus Lupin and Sirius Black, where the canon vector is on the edge. And this kind of points to a limitation of these sorts of things, because fan fiction authors are often writing about those characters in a different time frame, so widely different than the original series, I should say. So this is, when you're doing NLP work like this, you're often just capturing some of this like surface level stuff, and but also sometimes with more interesting social stuff. So that's a lesson there. But yes.
Do you have a rough idea of what the two axes you ended up with are?
That's a really good question. So no is the idea, and that's a disadvantage of this approach of TSNE, is that I could run this again, and it's like a little bit stochastic. So I would get probably similar clusters, but the whole thing would be shifted, who knows how, linearly. So So the axes don't really mean anything. So I dug in qualitatively to see which ones were closer, which ones were far apart, and it gave me kind of a similar story as what I described, where sometimes we have ones that are pretty close, and yes, they're characterized very similarly to the books, let's say, close to canon, that is. And sometimes it was like, oh, it's a lot different. The character isn't different, but it's written like a play, or it's written like a big long letter, or something like that. So it's hard to disentangle those things sometimes. Other questions? Okay, so from these two experiments, we've seen that, yes, word embedding approaches can capture some types of character framing. We see some evidence of differences in characterization and relationships, and we've matched those with some things that we know in fan fiction, which is good. All right, so conclusion overall. Here, we've come to the assumption that identity is not only reflected, but also constructed in language. So we have a couple of computational techniques to analyze and model the presentation of identity in discourse. Oops. Oh, yeah, so we've tried to, did I miss it? Okay, nope. So we tried to shift focus from predicting latent user attributes in language to exploring how people are actively positioning themselves and others in language. And this enables things like exploring the effects of the choice of cell presentation in the first experiment on Tumblr. And then it also acknowledges that identities can be framed and represented in very changing ways in narratives. So that's the fan fiction work so far. All right, so main takeaway here is language is embedded in social context. Be cognizant of that. Think about that when you're designing models, when you're designing NLP kind of things. All right, I think that is it for me. So I'm happy to take questions on anything.
Is there any reason, just out of curiosity,
Yeah.
not necessarily about the content, is there a reason why you picked this to be like the thing you were going to study?
Oh, that's a good question.
It's just not a very traditional, like, not many people would be like, oh, we want to talk about like how people identify. Like I can see Tumblr bios, but then like comparing canon and like thick relationships is not something people like think about. So is there a reason why you picked that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is kind of out of left field. So I would say that I've always been interested in how social media is embedded in language and how we are doing things like expressing our identities in language. And so I've sort of always had like one foot in computer science, but also reading more of the theories in these sort of humanities disciplines, and trying to bring those into those approaches. And I think a lot of what's interesting that's going on online is how people are doing things like in fan fiction that are representing gender and sexuality a lot different, and how that can even shift the needle here, like in broader society, on how we think about those issues. So yeah, it's that sort of a mindset, I guess. Yeah.
Is your pipeline available if somebody wanted to call some of the content?
Yeah, definitely. It's send me an email before you use it. It's like not quite up to snuff on like just downloading views. There's the URL. I think I sent the slides to somebody, so maybe the slides are URL. It's very hard to see there, but I've got the URL for it. So yeah, you can definitely. So the crawling. This actually doesn't crawl it for you. We already had a great research scientist crawl all this data for us. But there are like I just used a package on GitHub for actually crawling AO3. Do be sure you do a rate limit so you don't like bog those servers down. But it's a great data set. Yes. Other questions? Okay. I suppose that's it then. Thank you for listening to me about my work.